ventricular filling, we do have our first contraction, right? The SA node, like you said, is going to set off the atria first. So that's exactly what happens. This flowing from the atria to the ventricles happens passively for about 80% of the volume. That last 20% is due to atrial contraction. So think about this now, right? I have blood filling in my ventricles are starting to swell up, get full, and now I have sort of an equal amount of blood in my atria and my ventricles. Okay? Blood's not going to want to flow from the atria to ventricles anymore unless I increase the pressure in my atria, and that's exactly what happens, right? I have atrial contraction or atrial systole, and that systole is going to squeeze the last 20% of blood into these ventricles, okay? So they're full. The next part of the cardiac cycle, okay, of course, after my atria contract, it shoots down into my AV node. My AV node then is going to delay the signal for a little bit, let the atria contract, and then shoot it into the AV bundle, which of course shoots it down to the ventricles. Okay, so now I start ventricular contraction or ventricular systole. Okay. During ventricular systole, the volume in my ventricles is decreasing, so what happens to my pressure? It increases, right?
Now, I get confused here. At this point, we have blood flow in the ventricular, in the ventricles, right?
Mhm.
So the volume is up, so the pressure will go down?
Yeah, but then we're starting systole, right? So systole is where the muscle wall of the ventricles now starts to contract, right? And so that's squeezing the volume. It's lowering the volume and increasing the pressure. Now that blood has to go somewhere. Okay? It wants to go in two directions, right? One of those directions is back into the atria, right? So what happens now? If my pressure increases in the ventricles, I'm pushing blood back into the atria. What's going to happen?
The valves closed.
Right, my AV valves shut.
What does that say right out of contraction?
Systole.
Systoles?
Yeah, systole.
Systoles?
Okay. So as soon as my ventricles start to contract, the pressure in my ventricles overcomes the pressure in my atria. Now I'm getting backflow into my atria, but it's prevented by the AV valves, right? The AV valves slam shut, and then we have this period of isovolumetric contraction. Okay. This is where both my AV valves and my semilunar valves are closed. This continues on until what happens?
Pushes through.
Into the blood?
Pushes through, basically. So until the pressure in my ventricles rises above the pressure where?
Large arc of the large
The great vessels,
The great
right?
vessels.
The pulmonary artery.
That's what I was looking for.
The aorta.
The aorta.
Okay, so again, for a little while, I have both of my valves closed. My AV valves are closed, my semilunar valves are closed, and I'm just building pressure as I start to squeeze on my ventricles. Okay, this is known as isovolumetric contraction. This happens again until my pressure in ventricles pressure in my ventricles is greater than pressure in great vessels. At this point, I enter the second part of ventricular systole. This is known as what? the ejection phase. Once my pressure in the ventricles is greater than my pressure in the great vessels, my ejection phase occurs, these semilunar valves slam open, and blood starts flowing down this pressure gradient again, from the ventricles to the great vessels. Oops. Should we put GB, great vessels? Okay. Then I enter the third phase of the cardiac cycle. After ventricular systole, what happens? Just right, ventricular diastole. I'm ejecting all this blood out into the great vessels. I'm eventually going to lose all that blood, and my muscle begins to relax. Again, when it starts to relax, my volume is getting larger, and therefore my pressure in the ventricles is doing what?
Going down?
Yeah. Eventually, the pressure in the ventricles gets so low that it's actually below the pressure in the great vessels. And then what happens? Where's my blood going to want to flow then?
Backwards.
Yeah, it's going to want to flow from my great vessels back into my ventricles. This is obviously not good. And so what happens is these semilunar valves close, and I get my second sound. Loved up. First sound here, love. Third sound. Okay. So then, again, what you notice is that my semilunar valves are closed, my AV valves are still closed, and I have a period of isovolumetric relaxation until eventually the pressure in my ventricles gets so low it goes below the pressure in my atria, and what happens?
And moves to the atrium.
The ventricular pressure goes below the pressure in the atria.
Oh, it wants to go back, but then it
Starts the
closes?
process over again.
It starts the process over again, right? Now, pressure in ventricles less than pressure in atria, and I begin ventricular filling again, right? Now blood starts to flow, AV valves open, right? Blood starts to flow from the atria to the ventricles. The ventricles start to fill. Unfortunately, no seats left. Though. Are you sure? Actually, there's 2 seats left. This one and that one over there. What a turnout.
So because the pressure's low in the ventricles, because blood is being pumped out, there's nothing else. Now, you have that force from that contraction. I mean, it's relaxed, and now it has to start the process again where more blood is coming into the atrium.
Right, again. it starts to relax, the volume increases, and therefore it's like creating a vacuum. Right? If you've ever
Like a suction.
yeah, it's creating a suction, right? As it relaxes, it's always creating a suction. So it relaxes, and it's actually starting to now pull blood from the atria, and that happens 80% passively. And then the last 20%, as it fills, now you have blood in the ventricles and in the atria, so blood's not going to flow into the ventricles anymore. But that last 20%, the atria start to squeeze, and it sort of pushes more blood into the ventricles. Then you start the next part. Yes.
When you said, okay, all these procedures happen, it goes through a complete cycle, it goes back to ventricular filling,
Yes.
and what is that, the AV valve, what is that?
The AV valves open, blood starts to flow down into the
I'm trying
ventricles.
to remember, what does AV mean?
Atrioventricular. There's the valves in between the atria and the ventricles. Atrioventricular valve. Okay. Any other questions about this stuff? Again, if you think about all this stuff as pressure changes, and whenever I have a pressure going above or going below another pressure, I have three pressures I'm worried about: atrial pressure, ventricular pressure, and my great vessel pressure. If one of those crosses another, I usually have some sort of valve opening or closing. I won't say usually, I always have a valve opening and closing. Okay. So the first one, the AV valves open, we're filling the ventricles. As the ventricle starts to squeeze, my pressure goes up in the ventricles, overcomes the atria, and my AV valve closes. I have isovolumetric contraction for a period until my ventricle pressure goes over my great vessel pressure, and then my semilunar valve opens. Then my pressure begins to dive again during diastole. Once my pressure comes back down below my great vessel pressure, the semilunar valves close, and once it comes below my atrial pressure, my AV valves open. Okay, so 4 events: open AV valves, shut AV valves, no, close AV valves. We start with AV valves open. Close AV valves, open semilunar, close semilunar, open AV. Okay, think of it this way as a cycle, all right? And it should be a little bit more simple. Any questions at all? We'll move on. Again, I can do this stuff all day. It's important that you go home and try to do it yourself. Okay? I'm not going to ask anyone to do it in class today, although it is fun for me to watch that. We'll just do it this way. I'm going to erase this.
Okay.
Okay, so now we've really talked about two things, electrical activity and mechanical activity. Now these two things are very much related. Of course, the pacemaker cells are responsible for the electrical activity, and they're connected to the cardiomyocytes via gap junctions, which are responsible for the mechanical activity. All right, so I have these pacemakers, which again are sort of like the electricity of the heart, right? They're like the generators of the heart. They generate the electric signal, which sets off these contractors. Okay, so when I mentioned before, ventricular systole and ventricular diastole, we're worried about two volumes here in order to determine how much blood we're actually pumping. Okay, one of these volumes is known as the end diastolic volume. Okay, so at the end of diastole, at the end of ventricular relaxation, EDV refers to
The volume of blood still there?
right, how much blood did we pack into this ventricle? It relaxed, and we started filling it with blood. Atrial contraction, we even squeeze more blood in. How large did this ventricle get? How swollen with blood did this ventricle get? Okay. We're also worried about ESV, right? This is the end of systole, or end systolic volume. Okay. End systolic volume is talking about how much blood, well, it's talking about what?
The volume of blood that's still there after it contracts?
Right, after you're contracted, after you've done the squeezing, how much blood is left? You're not going to squeeze all the blood out. Okay, so how much blood is left in the ventricles after we've done this contraction? Okay, we're worried about these two numbers because together If I take my EDV and subtract my ESV, I end up with this number here, stroke volume. Okay, and stroke volume is literally how much blood I'm pumping out of the heart with every beat. This is a good number to know because it's going to inform you of your cardiac output, right? It's one of the things that informs you of your cardiac output. What's the other one?
Heart rate.
Heart rate. Okay, so I'll write these up. Stroke volume. Heart rate. Cardiac output. Again, cardiac output is sort of like your general measure of how well your heart's working. How much blood can I get to the systemic circuit? How much blood can I get to the pulmonary circuit to pick up oxygen? And, you know, again, pump that oxygenated blood to the systemic circuit so the tissues have oxygen, nutrients to do whatever they do. Of course, without oxygen nutrients, your cells don't live. Okay, so we want to monitor our cardiac output. We want to know what affects our cardiac output. And to do that, we look to these two factors, stroke volume, heart rate. So again, stroke volume, EDV minus ESV. What kind of things might affect my EDV? What kind of things might affect my ESV? High blood pressure affects which one? So in diastolic volume, how much blood is returning to the heart during filling? How would blood pressure affect that?
The vessels are constricted, it can't flow, so it causes depression.
It causes the pressure to rise, but as we're moving towards, as we move around the systemic circuit, we're actually now entering the veins. Okay, and the veins usually do not have a lot of pressure plaque. They have very low pressure in themselves. So when we're talking about blood pressure, we're really not affecting the EDV as much as we're affecting the ESV. Okay, again, blood pressure is going to affect blood pressure is something known as afterload. Okay, this blood pressure, of course, is increased in the arteries. Okay, the arteries is where the ventricles are pumping their blood into, right? So if I have a higher blood pressure, and we just talked about it, if I have a higher blood pressure in my arteries, now my ventricle pressure, in order to open up the semilunar valves and inject blood, have to go more, and they have to get higher, right? They have to have a higher pressure as well, okay? But they don't really do that, right? They go to a certain pressure and then they come back down, certain pressure and come back down. So if I start raising my blood pressure too high, now I'm minimizing the amount of ejection time I have, right? So blood pressure is affecting my ESV in a negative way, right? The higher my afterload, well, actually, not in a negative way, I shouldn't say that. The higher my afterload, what happens to my in-systolic volume? It goes up. If I have more pressure combating the ability to eject blood, then I'm not going to be able to eject as much blood. And therefore, the volume of blood left in my ventricles is higher. Now, what does that do to my stroke volume? It brings it down, right? If I'm subtracting by a larger number, my stroke volume goes down, right? Everybody sees this. EDV, let's just throw on some random numbers here. 10. Let's say my ESV is 1 normally, then I have a stroke volume of 9. But my EDV is 10, and my ESV is increased due to afterload, so now it's 3. Well, now my stroke volume goes down, it's a 7. Okay? And just throwing arbitrary numbers in there, not numbers that mean anything.
Before you go on, I'm lost now. The EDV, I just wanna make sure I understand, cause I
Sure.
see with pictures,
Sure.
so I'm not seeing anymore. All I'm hearing is numbers, so if you can just make clear to me. We're talking here where, we've already ejected the blood from the ventricles. Now we're talking about the pressure difference between the greater vessels and the ventricles. Is that where we are when we talk about the ESV?
So what we're talking about with EDV is how much blood is left in the ventricles after relaxation in diastolic volume. Again, diastole.
After they went through, after they went through the cycle, and there's still some blood left in the ventricle.
Well, we're not totally through the cycle yet. We're just done with diastole, which is relaxation. Okay, so before we have any contraction, how much blood is filling this ventricle, right? So EDV, you know, if I have my heart here, I have a big swollen ventricle because of all this blood in there. I'm talking about ESV, now it's my end systolic volume. And I draw my same heart up here. But this time, you know, I have way less blood because it's been squeezed out. Right? My EDV is when my ventricles are full. ESV is after they've ejected their blood. Does that make sense? Okay, so now what we're talking about with afterload is the pressure that is in the aorta. And of course, when I'm squeezing blood out of the heart, it has to overcome the pressure in the aorta in order for blood to move out of the heart, right? Blood's always going to move down its pressure gradient, so the pressure in the ventricle must be higher than the pressure in the aorta. If I have chronically high blood pressure for whatever reason, this increases something known as afterload. Okay, afterload is the pressure I must overcome here to eject stuff from the heart. So again, the ventricular pressure is going to go up and down like this, and at some point it overcomes the pressure in the aorta, which sort of looks like this, right? If my aortic pressure is increased, right, now I have less time here to eject blood, right? Here, before I have this whole period of time to eject blood. That means I'm going to inject more blood. Here I have way less time to eject blood. That means I'm going to inject less blood. So what happens to my ESV is instead of ejecting a bunch of blood, now I have more blood here because I couldn't eject it. And so what happens to my stroke volume, the difference between this and this, is it gets smaller, right? My EDV is the same, my ESV is increased, therefore my stroke volume is decreased. Does that make sense?
Here's my,
I don't know how else to describe it. Yeah. But, imagine, you're squeezing a tube of toothpaste, right? This is your ventricle. Okay, you start with a filled tube of toothpaste and you squeeze it. Now imagine I put my hand on top of the tube of toothpaste and you try to squeeze it. And you only get one squeeze, okay? Just one same squeeze. But because my hand's on top, it's blocking some of the toothpaste from leaving. Therefore, my end systolic volume is up because not all the toothpaste leaves, and my stroke volume goes down. The amount I squeeze out with each squeeze goes down because it speeds up. Okay, so my afterload, due to blood pressure, is going to increase my ESV and affect stroke volume in a negative way down, and therefore affect my cardiac output. This is why high blood pressure is such a bad thing, because you're squeezing less blood with each pump, and that can cause a downstream effect to cause your heart to work harder, right? Your heart does not want to work harder. The harder it works,
if you're squeezing less blood, is that increasing pressure?
no. Squeezing less blood would cause a decrease in pressure, but don't worry about that. Just don't worry. But here's what we have. Okay, what are some of the other ways we can affect stroke volume?
Premature ventricular conduction, VCs.
Oh yeah, but we have three, preload, right? This is one of the ones I'm looking for. Okay, preload. Preload refers to what? Well, let's just say if my afterload is affecting my ESV, what is my preload going to affect? My EDV, right, before contraction. And the preload is affecting my EDV by adding more blood, right? Preload is defined as the amount of blood returning to the heart, right? Venous return. The more preload I have, the more my ventricles fill, and so the higher my EDV. Now, what does that do to stroke volume? If I have a higher EDV, it's going to increase my stroke volume and increase my cardiac output. Right? Everyone sees this. I have a higher number which I'm subtracting from. This increases my stroke volume, and therefore increases my cardiac output. We have one more thing that affects our stroke volume. This is your contractility. And it's, again, affecting your ESP. Contractility is defined as how strong the heart pumps, right? How hard it squeezes. And so the harder I squeeze, the less volume is going to be left. If I squeeze that tube of toothpaste as hard as I possibly can, versus if I just squeeze it a little bit, how much, what's going to be the difference in ESP? Or the toothpaste left in the tube?
It's gonna go down.
It's going to be less if I squeeze harder. So when my contractility goes up, my ESP goes down, my stroke volume then goes up or down.
Oh.
Right, if I'm subtracting by a lower number, my ESP goes up, and my cardiac output goes up. Okay, again, on the exam, you will have to know how contractility affects cardiac output, how preload affects cardiac output, or how afterload affects stroke volume, how contractility affects stroke volume, all these different things, all these different relationships. Okay, and it's simply just walking through it logically, right? If I squeeze harder, less volume left after squeezing, more volume ejected, cardiac output goes up. Okay, so that's just stroke volume. Now we're going to worry about heart rate. What are some of the things that can affect heart rate?
Exercise.
Well, in general, right, we have the autonomic nervous system here. And we have two divisions of the autonomic nervous system, which are sympathetic and parasympathetic. The sympathetic is known as your fight or flight response, correct? Yes?
Yes.
Okay. So, the sympathetic is going to increase your heart rate. Parasympathetic is going to decrease your heart rate. Parasympathetic is known as your rest and digest. So if you're resting, your heart rate's obviously not going up. If you're fighting or flying, you need your heart rate to go up. Okay, again, this will be maybe one question on your exam. Like what happens during a sympathetic innervation of the heart, right? What happens if you have increased sympathetic activity to your heart rate? Okay. Furthermore, it's not just the autonomic nervous system that we're worried about. We're also worried about things we find in the blood, right, or extracellular fluid. Okay. What are some of these things? What kind of things do you find in the blood? Oxygen,
Hormones.
carbon dioxide, hormones, right? So hormones is good. Epinephrine, which is really like adrenaline, right? This is going to cause an increase in heart rate. And the hormone we talked about earlier today, thyroxine, which comes from the thyroid, increases your heart rate. What else do you find in the blood besides hormones?
Electrolytes.
Electrolytes. How are electrolytes going to affect my heart rate? Which electrolytes are going to affect my heart rate?
Potassium, sodium.
Potassium, maybe sodium. We didn't talk about sodium though. We talked about calcium. So how does potassium affect my heart rate? And why might you think that?
Sets off the pacemaker.
so potassium is responsible for depolarization of your pacemaker cells. Well, of all cells, really. So what happens if we have too much potassium in the extracellular fluid, interstitial fluid?
Becomes more positive.
Okay, so let's think about this. Remember, the cell,
Because that's the fluid on the outside, the interstitial fluid.
yeah, right, if I have a bunch of calcium inside this, excuse me, potassium inside the cell, and now let's just say, I don't know, something's wrong with my kidneys where I can't get rid of potassium, or I injected myself with bananas or something, I don't know. We have a large amount of potassium now outside the cell. Again, you said potassium is responsible for, this is a pacemaker cell. Potassium is responsible for number 3. If I have large amounts of potassium outside my cell already, what's going to happen to my number 3? It's going to last longer. It's going to be harder to move potassium out of the cell because there's already a bunch of potassium out there, right? So this 3, instead of looking like, this, and my heartbeat is here, now it might look like that. And so what happens to the pace of my heart? It slows down, right? So potassium in high concentrations slows the heart down, and vice versa. Potassium in low concentrations speeds the heart up. Now what about calcium? Again, we can think about this in the same way. High amounts of calcium out here. What if I add even more calcium because I just, I'm starting to break down my bones unnecessarily so. The parathyroid gland tumor causes it. Okay, so calcium is responsible for which portion of this? It's responsible for 2. If I have even more calcium, what is going to happen to my 2? Even more calcium outside, so calcium is coming in even more easily.
Two's gonna last longer.
No, it'll be shorter because I have even more calcium out here. Right, so I have a higher concentration gradient and calcium floods in faster than before. Okay, so now my thing might look like this, right? And my heart rate is speeding up. Of course, if I have low amounts of calcium, right, let's say I have low amounts of calcium out here, now it takes a longer time for my heart, for my cell to actually get the calcium in. And so my 2 might look like this. And my heart rate slows down. Alright, so can everybody follow that a little bit? Again, these electrolytes are really important to maintain at normal levels. If we have too little calcium, our heart will eventually stop. Okay? So people who have trouble maintaining calcium or absorbing calcium or whatever it is, will actually break down their bones, which have huge stores of calcium, to make sure the heart continues to work. Right? This happens to a lot of people with some sort of parathyroid dysfunction or sometimes kidney dysfunction. Is their bones start to get weaker because they're not able to keep the calcium in their blood, and therefore they're replacing it with their bone calcium. Okay, so make sure that you're aware of this sort of thing.
So, the negative side makes it around if you have too much potassium in your cell, we're saying that, it will speed up. Is that what you're saying with the arrow going up?
No, this is, the negative refers to slowing heart
Slowing
rate.
it down.
Positive would refer to speeding up heart rate. Okay, so again, my sympathetic nervous system is going to speed my heart rate up. Fight or flight, parasympathetic rest and digest is going to slow it down. These 2 hormones, adrenaline and thyroxine, both speed the heart rate up. And then when I'm talking about electrolytes, large amounts of potassium outside the cell slows my heart rate down. Again, because it makes potassium harder to leave, and therefore that repolarization happens for over a longer period of time. At low amounts, it makes it easier to leave and happens way quicker. Calcium, high amounts, again, I'm increasing the concentration gradient so calcium floods the cell faster, right? So my heart rate speeds up. Low amounts, it's harder to get calcium in, and therefore it slows my heart rate down. Okay. I think that's pretty good for cardiac output. Does anybody know of anything I'm missing? Okay, I know this seems like a lot, because it is. But in chapter 19, we will build on this. Okay, so it's important to know for now, and I'll make sure that you probably have 5 or 6 questions on it on the exam, right? But you're gonna use it in chapter 19 as well. So, you know, when we talk about mean arterial pressure is the result of cardiac output and systemic vascular resistance.
Can you pass me my backpack?
Michael Kors,
It's my sister.
is it real?
Yes.